Hello and welcome to the F1 Strategy Report, powered by Apex Race Manager, the mobile race management simulator. My name's Michael Lamonato, and this is round 19, the Mexican Grand Prix. Lewis Hamilton needed to finish only 7th to win the championship, which he duly did with an unremarkable 4th place in Mexico City. But he was more than 70 seconds off winner Max Verstappen at the flag. Such were Mercedes' difficulties. To discuss how Hamilton won the championship despite having such a terrible race, I'm joined by Luke Smith, F1 editor at Crash.net. Luke, how are you doing?
I'm good, Michael. How are you?
I'm very good. We're in a beautiful park in Mexico City on a lovely day. The morning after the day before, as I think they say for certain things. Never really been clear why they say that, but it's certainly the situation we find ourselves in. And after a week of something of a holding pattern for Formula One as far as the championship's concerned, Lewis Hamilton is finally a 5-time title winner.
Yes, and I think it's something that has been on the cards for a long, long time. I think the writing's been on the wall for a few races now. But finally we've got our third 5-time world champion in F1 history, and it's a real remarkable achievement. But he managed it in rather unremarkable circumstances, it must be said.
Yeah, if you wanted to define Lewis Hamilton's season, it was certainly not this race. He's had far more representative Grand Prix. We'll talk a little bit about exactly why Mercedes struggled so much in a moment. But just to give Hamilton, I suppose, his due, winning this title, we've seen a little bit of a different side. I feel like we say this every time he wins the championship, but a little bit of a different side of him in the fact that he's really adopted what has been a really quite effective race-by-race approach. And we sort of saw that after he won the title, where he still seemed focused on winning the Brazilian Grand Prix after this.
Yeah, and it's something that I think has served him very well this year. And I think away from the intra-team battle he had at Mercedes before with Nico Rosberg, where it was sort of this very, very toxic rivalry that I think consumed everything at the team, he's now been able to just focus on Vettel and just focus on Ferrari, and that's allowed them to move into this sort of race-by-race basis and way of thinking, and it's worked really well for him. And I mean, he was asked after the race, you've just won your 5th World Championship, what are you going to do to celebrate? And he said, I just want to go to sleep. I just want to rest up and see my dogs. And then he said, but on to the next one. I want to win this Constructors' Championship, and realised why Mercedes were so slow in Mexico, which is something they need to get to the bottom of, definitely.
Yeah, and this is perhaps the most interesting part of this Grand Prix, because in the United States, we had an unusual race. Ferrari had become resurgent after discovering a variety of botched upgrades, took them off the car, was suddenly much faster. And Mercedes was off the pace, but that was fairly easy to write off as saying, well, there was no practice on Friday. Ferrari had clearly improved. They revealed that there was a major setup problem after making some changes on Sunday morning. So it was easy to sort of disregard that. But we arrived in Mexico City. Nothing unusual about the weekend other than the fact that Mexico City is a bit of a unique environment. Of course, we'll talk about the altitude momentarily, but this was really quite a shocking weekend for Mercedes, probably the worst of their season. Yeah,
I know, definitely the worst of their season. I think it was a weekend that really exposed some of the big weaknesses with the W09 car, which for the most part this season has been very, very strong. We saw flashes of its weaknesses on the softer compounds at points through the year, but for the most part it's got on top of those, we thought, towards the end of the season. But now it seems like that old issue is back again, and Mercedes really, really struggled for pace all weekend over the long runs. Qualifying, they managed to work something out with the engine modes to get back in contention, get Lewis Hamilton third on the grid, but that was about as good as it got for the team, really. After that, then in the race they were just completely off the pace, and I think probably the big standout stat is that after the first round of pit stops, Valtteri Bottas, he was 15 seconds ahead of Kimi Räikkönen. So that seemed to be, the position was his. 15 seconds is a lot to make up, and Kimi had caught him up by the end of Valtteri's stint on those set of tyres, and by the end of the race Bottas was a lap down on the race winner. So it was quite remarkable to see the dip in pace from Mercedes.
It's going to be interesting to see over the last 2 rounds how that plays out, whether that is something either they repair or whether it really was something unique to Mexico City, because as we mentioned, Mexico City is a unique race. It's definitely not the first time you'll have heard it this week, but at very high altitude, 2.2 kilometres, more than 2.2 kilometres. I'm not going to convert that to feet. You'll have to work it out for yourself, or miles. Which plays havoc with these cars. That's 22% less air density. And of course, when cars are today all about aerodynamics, that's essentially 22% less aerodynamics. And that has all sorts of effects on cooling and tyres.
Yeah, exactly. And Brendan Hartley explained it really, really well on Thursday. He said that even though they put the maximum downforce package they can and get the car as planted to the track as possible, putting all the bits and bobs on the car, they've still actually got less downforce than Monza, purely because the air is so thin and it creates so many issues. So it's it's a real challenge for all of the teams. I mean, all of the drivers, they say their cars feel very slippery and they're not really in control 100% of the time, but they look at the timesheets and say, oh no, actually we're still very quick. So it's a strange conundrum that they've all got to deal with. Cooling as well is a real big issue. I mean, we saw lots of teams saying that they had to turn their engines down or make adjustments because of the cooling problems. So we saw that the Renault powered teams, which traditionally wouldn't be able to compete in a straight fight at a track like this with Ferrari and Mercedes, they were really, really up there. And of course, Red Bull Renault getting victory.
Yeah, with the front row lockout and what could well have been a 1-2 finish had it not been for another failure, technical retirement for Daniel Ricciardo. Allied to the problems of the thinness of the air and exacerbating them really is what has become a little bit of a dilemma for Pirelli, I think, is the tyre selection for this round. The softest tyres in Pirelli's range were brought here, the super soft, ultra soft and hyper soft, in that order, from hardest to softest. Look forward to 2019, everybody. The problem is, of course, that it lacks grip. That's been a problem ever since Mexico arrived on the calendar because of the aerodynamics. But having softer tyres does not necessarily compensate for that. And what we saw, everyone loaded up on hypersoft tyres, brought very few super soft and ultra softs. But the tyres were extremely brittle because they were sliding so much. And we actually had this weird conundrum after Friday thinking that no one's going to be able to finish the race if they're only going to use hypersofts.
Yeah, it was very strange. As you said, they all went for, I think, a minimum of 8 sets of hypersofts. And I think a couple of drivers, they went for very, very few sets of the supers and the ultras. And then I think come practice, when the first hypersoft issues appeared, I think a lot of teams were like, oh, right, we've not got enough sets of the other compounds. So, like, for example, Toro Rosso, they did no running at all with the supersofts through practice because they said we've got to save those for the race. And as I'm sure we'll come on to, that worked out quite well for them. But then other teams like, Mercedes, for example, they were in a position where after Hamilton's first pit stop, he was complaining about his new Supersoft, saying, look, these really aren't working well, don't think I'm going to get to the end. And Merck were like, well, that's all you've got. All that was left was a five lap old set of ultra softs that in the end he did take on. And it did cause a lot of issues. And I think Pirelli, I think they wanted to spice things up a bit, and obviously, the last few years it has been pretty obvious how strategy goes in Mexico. So they thought, well, if we go as soft as possible, at least we'll get maybe 2 stops. And but I don't think anyone quite foresaw the issues that followed. And drivers saying that their hypersofts on Friday would only last sort of 4 or 5 laps and then just start to drop off completely. And that's why it was really surprising that so many drivers actually managed to do a one-stop race starting on the hypersofts as well.
So we had this superb unknown situation going into the race because so many drivers, as you said, had no experience on the super soft. Some didn't even really have much experience on ultra soft tyres, which of course, when you're planning a strategy that could be as many as 2 stops, and obviously all teams want to try and do 1 stop, given the pit stop time here is quite long because of the speed of the front straight, created this great unknown situation, and everyone thought it was going to be really strategically interesting race, which it was in some parts. But to touch on Red Bull Racing as well, the flip side of the coin, if Mercedes struggled for all of those reasons, Red Bull Racing seemed to have essentially no problems for any of those same reasons. We mentioned the engine power being chief amongst them, but I guess this is just more reinforcement that Red Bull chassis is actually really very, very good.
Definitely, yeah. The RB14 car it's fantastic, and I think we saw that this weekend. We saw in Monaco earlier this year just how strong it can be when you need maximum downforce, and that shone through again here. I mean, they were untouchable all weekend. Tyre issues, they weren't affecting Red Bull as severely as the other teams. Verstappen, I think he only moved on to a 2-stop really just to cover off Vettel and make sure that there wasn't any threat towards the end if there was a safety car. Ricciardo, he tried to do a 1-stop and he would have made it towards the end of his race. I think his super softs had done something like 45 laps and he was still setting the fastest lap of the race in purple sectors. And he was very, very quick. So I mean, it does show that Red Bull fundamentally have a very good race car, and had it not been for, I think, a litany of reliability issues, then they would probably have a lot more points to their name.
Yeah, absolutely. And they were the two sides of that coin. Ferrari was somewhere in the middle. They had superb straight line speed, which we saw play out in the battle between Ricciardo and Hamilton, and then very briefly Sebastian Vettel, who essentially breezed past both of them in a series of a couple of laps, and also showed how, even though the Renault engine was quite competitive, still couldn't really compete with the Mercedes in terms of a straight line battle. But if the front runner showed us anything, and we're going to say that Mercedes essentially was a bit of an exception here because they had such poor tyre wear, but the super soft tyre amongst all of them was actually really quite a good race tyre. Some drivers did almost the entire race, bar about 10 or 11 laps on this tyre. And it was the key, as you said, to Max Verstappen's strategy, being able to run a long one like that. It must be extremely concerning for a team like Mercedes to have to, as you said, Hamilton he didn't feel like he'd even be able to make them last the entire distance. Does it make you think this could be a longer term problem for Mercedes?
Well, I think the fortune for them is that we are 2 races away from the end of the season now, and that they have one title secured, the other one they got a pretty healthy buffer, and I think it's just going to be another regret that we have for this championship, that through the middle part of the season Ferrari didn't capitalise on more of its opportunities, because otherwise we'd have had this thrilling race to I think spice up the title race and put another swing in Vettel's favour, and for the Constructors' Championship it'd probably be quite close as well, but instead like we're looking at this, that Ferrari, they're just about clawing in there and just about staying in the Constructors' fight. But I think Mercedes, they'll look to next year's car and they'll say that the W09, what were the big weaknesses, and I think on the softest compounds, that was the big problem, and they got away with it at a few races, and obviously where Pirelli reduced the tread as well of the tyres, that did play into their favour. But here this weekend we saw the car and the team at its absolute weakest. They've got the same tyre selection coming up for Abu Dhabi as well, so that will I think be another test for them. Heading into next year, the team never rests. They never say, look, this car is perfect, let's just do the same again next year. They will, I think, be thinking that soft tyre running, that is absolutely what they need to focus on and improve.
The race was essentially decided by Max Verstappen getting a great start off the line compared to Daniel Ricciardo's extremely poor start. Ricciardo had a risk of dropping all the way to 4th or 5th at the first turn, managed to consolidate 3rd, which became 2nd because he was behind Hamilton, who struggled so much on his super soft tyres. As you said, he could have run a 1-stop, ultimately retired. That left Sebastian Vettel on his 2-stop race behind him. Showed that 2-stop race was actually fairly quick, as Pirelli said, but tyre management, if you could manage the tyres, a 1-stop was certainly viable. Raikkonen was 3rd, Hamilton was 4th, and Bottas 5th, some way off the pace. Bottas even tried to run the hypersoft at the very end of the race just because he could, I suppose. Ended up a lap down as a result, though. But what's behind them is what I find is really quite interesting, and there was this fascinating strategy dichotomy that started on qualifying, well, really started in practice and played out during the race, and that was the battle for the head of the midfield, which so many times this season has proved to be almost the more interesting part. And I feel like it's really reared its head, I think it was in Singapore, wasn't it, or in Russia, where teams that qualified and drivers that qualified just outside the top 10 and therefore had free tyre choice had a massive advantage over the midfield cars that qualified in the top 10 and were confined to starting on the softest tyre of the weekend. Force India took this so seriously that they essentially deliberately didn't attempt to make the top 10 shootout in qualifying because they thought it would be a huge tyre advantage for them. Yeah,
it's a weird situation, and I know Formula One, they introduced this new tyre rule where your Q2 tyre is your starting tyre to try and basically prevent teams from not going out in Q3. Now we are seeing the other side of that, and as you rightly said, in Singapore it was that the drivers who started 11th, 12th and 13th, they all got the jump and all moved up into the points, because avoiding the hypersoft tyre was that much of an advantage. Russia, teams tried it again. Renault deliberately didn't go out in Q2 because they could get 11th and 12th on the grid. Force India here, they decided let's go for an ultra soft run, and that if we get into the top 10 on ultra soft's great because then we're on the better starting tyre, but we'd rather miss out and not have to start on hypersofts, which is a strange situation. I asked Charlie Whiting about it after the race and said, is there a plan to fix this? And he said, I do want to take a wider look at tyres. And he said, even looking at the idea of practice sets, where so you have wet tyres, so people can actually do running in practice, for example. And he said it all kind of comes in one blob, and he said that would also tie in with the proposed qualifying change as well, with the Q4 maybe. So that I think is something he really wants to push for 2020, and that would be very good. It's a very weird situation. I think that showed just how scared teams were about this whole hypersoft tyre, how they thought that it would last but a few laps, they would have to pit, they would come out right at the back, and then they would essentially still be on the same strategy as everybody else, just having lost track positions. So it was a very, very weird situation, but hopefully F1 they can find a fix for the future.
It's an interesting question because it is one that has been addressed, as you said, for the last couple of rounds or last couple of months, really, because it does make Q2, ultimately is only the middle segment of qualifying, so it's not the end of the world, but makes Q2 a bit of a fizzer. Certainly Russia was a good example because a combination of penalties meant essentially nobody was in jeopardy in Q2. But this really speaks more, at least in my opinion, to the fact that we have that second class of Formula One, doesn't it? Because if the front runners weren't so far away that it was irrelevant, they were always going to qualify for Q2, then that tyre choice would actually be a genuine risk rather than a decision just not to participate, wouldn't it? Because then you'd have all top 10 cars, let's say, at risk of not making it by running the what we can say the prime tyre, I suppose, like the harder tyre. So it really just shows how all of these problems that people like to complain about in Formula One, and for sure Formula One has problems, but they are largely interrelated, which speaks to why it's so difficult to fix any one of them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's something that obviously Liberty and the F1 boss, they've said we want to fix. We want a more competitive order for the future. And yeah, it is crucial that they get to that point, and hopefully we have a more even playing field. But it would again fix this problem whereby if you had 10 drivers, not 4 basically, concerned, are we going to drop out in Q2 by going for the harder compound? So yeah, I mean, hopefully that will help when they do come around to finding a fix and sort of evening out the field a little bit as well. But yeah, I think it is just evidence of just how far clear that the front runners are, and it's also the fact that even though they run a compound that might be, say, a second a lap slower, they still finish all in the top 6. They don't even get close to worrying about, are we going to drop out? So it's a very weird situation.
Now, this qualifying gamble of Force India's, and it's worth pointing out that Renault and Sauber both thought about it, they said, and decided the track position would probably be more worthwhile in Mexico. Maybe they assumed that, unlike in Singapore, where part of the problem was time management was so severe that the field was completely bunched up even by the time we got to around lap 10 or when the pit stop window was. Here the problem wasn't quite so bad, so they had a point. We never really got to see it play out because Force India had a fairly disappointing weekend, I think it's fair to say. Almost had 2 retirements. Ocon in the end didn't retire. We thought he was going to, but he didn't. Ocon essentially counted himself out almost immediately because there was a bit of a kerfuffle with, I think it was Carlos Sainz, one of the Renault cars in any case, at the first lap, forced him to pit pretty much immediately. Sergio Perez, though, is the interesting one because he was running up until the mid-30s in terms of laps before he was forced to retire. Disappointing for all the home fans, obviously. But he was running behind Leclerc, who was behind Hülkenberg. Sainz also retired from this race, and Ericsson was further back. He was adamant, though, and I quote, could have finished at least 7th, which for some reason implies maybe he could have finished higher into the front runners. I don't know if he's just being overly optimistic. But it was very much in play, this strategy. But interestingly enough, as we've talked about, the Supersoft was such a backbone for strategy at the Mexican Grand Prix. He was ending his race with a fairly long stint on the Ultrasoft. He pitted on lap 30. Do you feel like that would have been long enough to make it past Hülkenberg, considering the Supersoft, as you said with Daniel Ricciardo, for example, seemed to just keep going, whereas the Ultrasoft did have a definite tyre life?
He moved from the Supersoft to the Ultrasoft, didn't he? Yeah. So I think his idea of finish at least 7th, I think it's very, very, very optimistic, and even getting to the end of the race without having to come in again is a really very optimistic. And I think Force India probably looked at the battle with Leclerc and thought, let's bring him in and make sure we don't lose any more time. And obviously they're having a really, really close wheel-to-wheel battle, but in doing so that would have compromised the strategy. I mean, going 41 laps on the Ultrasoft. So that's a real big ask. I don't think anyone in the race achieved that. So it's very optimistic, I think, what he said. And I think he was definitely in the running to pick up a good haul of points. He's always been in the points in Mexico until this year, so it would have been a good result, definitely. But I think Force India maybe just need to be a bit more realistic and think that really, they could have played that strategy a bit smarter. Obviously, in the end, it didn't matter anyway. He had a brake failure, which forced him to retire. But it's very optimistic.
Yeah, I think it was really telling, and this has been spoken about in the last couple of races when we talk about undercut, overcut, and that specific few lap window around the pit stop when the tyres are at their best. Worth noting, Perez, they were used Ultrasoft, he switched onto on lap 30, and did spend, I think, around 5 laps battling with Leclerc, who was on Supersofts, already a couple of laps old, in fact nearly 15 laps old at that point. Certainly would have taken the better part of the life out of those Ultrasoft tyres, but also interesting to show that Leclerc clearly had the car to compete with the Force India this weekend, which I think certainly would have contributed to his final result. Yeah,
definitely, and I think it's been very impressive to see what Sauber have done this year, how far they've come. The result in Mexico lifted them up to 8th in the Constructors' Championship above Toro Rosso, really good result there. Again, they really did have the pace, and you've got to think that Leclerc and Perez in a straight fight, okay, you might say that Force India is a little bit faster, but Leclerc had the better tyre, the fresher tyre. It worked all in his favour. So I think then you've got to revise it again and say, well, Perez, realistically, 8th was probably the best he could hope for, and then that's not accounting for a late stop anywhere, or I don't know. But it's, I think Sauber really, really good shape this weekend.
So Hülkenberg and Leclerc were the drivers that proved starting in the top 10 was the better strategy. Playing with track position was the better strategy for the midfield. But it was interesting that a long second stint on the Supersoft as well did play into the hands of a couple of other drivers. Stoffel Vandoorne, chief amongst them, finished 8th, his equal best result of the season. much needed, I think. First points score since Azerbaijan,
Yes,
wasn't it?
yep.
Yeah, just in time for him to move series. It's never too late, Stoffel. It's never too late. He came from way out of the points, as is McLaren's usual standard from qualifying, with a 12-lap stint on the Ultrasoft to start with, then a long stint on the Supersofts. Did take advantage of a couple of things. We'll talk about Haas momentarily. That was one that gained virtually everybody 2 places towards the end of the race. Also, the Williams were typically uncompetitive, but it showed that long stint on the Supersoft really did pretty much circumvent all of the tyre concerns and allowed him to score some pretty good points.
Yeah, definitely. And Stoffel spoke after the race and he said how the tyres sort of came back to him, and all of the drivers, okay, they go through this graining phase and they go through, they don't feel too great. But as the stint wore on, he was able to find a bit more time and slowly work his way up the order. And he was really, really strong towards the end, very, very consistent, and made the tyres last, which was an excellent drive from him that I think really needs to be pointed out and made clear, that for all of the doom and gloom about McLaren this year and for all of the hype around Fernando Alonso's departure, Stoffel has actually, he's not always been terrible. There have been points this year where it's been maybe not great and you're like, oh, come on. But no, in Mexico he was absolutely fantastic, managed his tyres perfectly, and he didn't fall into the trap that so many others did, going that these tyres are shot, I need another stop. He remained confident, he stuck with them, nursed them well at the beginning of the stint, and 4 richly deserved points that hopefully we can see a repeat of that in the coming races, so we can have a good swan song in F1.
The way the Supersofts degraded was a really key point, and really key to all those drivers that ran a long stint towards the end, because we hear about these graining phases. You sometimes hear engineers over team radios telling their drivers. I think Hamilton was told that at one point when he was complaining quite vociferously about degradation on his tyres. The graining was by virtue of the fact that cars are sliding around so much, there's not enough downforce generated, but they managed to work through that, pretty much all of the cars, Daniel Ricciardo being a chief candidate for that, likewise Kimi Raikkonen, who didn't stop a second time, and it gripped up and sort of worked. I guess that really underlined the fact that they were being told that during the race, how little experience they had on these tyres on this circuit meant this was a race where everyone was sort of driving by the seat of their pants a little bit, trying to figure it out as they went. And it was an opportunity, perhaps for the likes of a driver like Stoffel Vandoorne, to use that, I don't know if instinct is necessarily too strong a word in this situation, but that intuition that they might be able to get through that phase and be able to do quite well as a result.
Definitely. We've seen at other races, obviously, they'll do a complete practice program, have no tyre issues, and they can come back with all the data and say, right, this is how long these tyres are going to last, and it matches up pretty much perfectly. But this race, there wasn't any of that. It was that they didn't have the data for the Supersofts over really long runs. The softer compounds they were very, very concerned by. So they kind of were, as you say, just driving by the seat of their pants and sort of doing it on the fly and thinking, how much further can we push it and going into the unknown. And that really did, I think, bring out the best in drivers like Vandoorne, and to his credit, Marcus Ericsson did pretty much the same thing. So it's like, you've got to give a lot of credit where it's due, and I think that it is nice to see drivers not just working off what their engineers say and not saying, these tyres will be shot in this many laps, you can have a drop off, where they might maybe drop off by a couple of seconds and think, oh, okay, this is a bit of a problem, but just having that confidence to get the tyres back in the working range and deliver a result like the one that Vandoorne scored.
Marcus Ericsson finished 9th, as you said. He ran a longish stint on the Hypersoft tyre, actually, 16 laps to start the race, which probably was a couple of laps too long, but he didn't really have the pace of Leclerc on that opening stint, which meant he was dropped into deeper traffic and as a result finished 2 places behind his teammate. But Pierre Gasly was the final point scorer. A really interesting race for Pierre Gasly because he started last with a whole bunch of power unit and gearbox penalties and started on the Hypersoft tyre, which no one would have thought was correct, and arguably perhaps still was not correct because it didn't really contribute him to making up any ground in the race. But I was looking through my lap chart and pretty much right until the very end of the Grand Prix, he was last. He spent the whole race last. Yep. Did 2 stops unusually. His 2 second stints were on the Supersoft tyre. But all of a sudden, at the very end of the race, rose all the way up to 10th place. And this was partly because his car was just more competitive than others, didn't have to do too much overtaking. But it did show that the longer that Supersoft stint went on, the more advantage you got over to cars trying other strategies. And I suppose a good salvage job for Pierre Gasly and Toro Rosso.
100%. And we spoke after the race again, and I said, why start on the Hypersoft? What was that about? And I think the initial thinking was to get them out of the way early, drop into clear air, and then have some good pace while others struggled towards the end of their Hypersoft stint. And I think the virtual safety car kind of kiboshed that plan. But then, as you say, he was running last for pretty much most of the race. But when he fitted the Supersofts for, I think, his final stint, at the beginning of the stint, he really didn't push. He was taking it so easy. And he said, like, inside, it was really working against him. He's like, I know I can go so much faster and so much faster. But compared to seeing what the other drives were doing, Toro Rosso was saying to him, look, just go easy to begin with, because then at the end of the stint, you'll find big rewards. And that's what he did. As we saw the drop-off of times for other drivers and late pit stops, Gasly's tyres were still in very good nick. He was able to push. I think one of his great qualities this year has been his tyre management. So again, that came into play as well, and that meant towards the end of the race that he was able to fight with the likes of Brendan Hartley, his teammate, and Esteban Ocon as well, his old karting rival, and eventually score that final point for P10. So I mean, definitely a lot of good fortune involved in that point, but I think also credit where it's due for really good tyre management from Pierre, and good nous from Toro Rosso to say to him, look, just keep it easy for now, because you'll have bigger gains later on.
To really verbalise how it is that he made up all those positions, he won 2, and we'll talk about Haas in just a moment. Not that there's that much to talk about Haas, to be honest. But Romain Grosjean and Kevin Magnussen made their pit stops late. He passed them by virtue of the pit stops. Then passed both Williams cars, because the Williams cars were at the back up until then. They also finished ahead of the Haas cars, worth saying. And then passed Hartley. Hartley was allowed to let him go because he had a 5-second penalty for a skirmish with Ocon. And then got past Ocon, who was on those aging ultra-soft tyres that, again, Perez would have been on towards the end. Granted that Ocon had dropped back so early in the race with damage, so he was sort of out of position. And then found himself in 10th place. So it sort of worked out for him. It did rely on that tyre management, as you said. But very rapid climb up the order for Pierre Gasly. But to close this, perhaps with the most disappointing of notes, Haas. Real shocking race for them. There's not really too many words you can give for them. They've had a very good season generally. Usually we complain about their operational errors. This time, both eliminated in Q1, which is the way that it is in Mexico for Haas. Tried a contra strategy, got them absolutely nowhere, and they finished dead last in the race. Yeah,
it's bizarre. And this fight against Renault in the Constructors' Championship, it was, I think, at Monza looking so close, and obviously we had Grosjean's disqualification, and even then you're kind of thinking, well, Haas, they've got the quicker cars, so they should be in better shape. But then, like in recent races, they've really dipped off, and then this was a real low point of the season, I think. And in Monaco, they had a weekend where they were, again, painfully slow, and they had no idea why, and they said, look, we're really clueless as to what the issue is. And then here in Mexico, the same thing again. Look, you look at the maximum downforce, and maybe the VF18, it just doesn't really work as well when it gets into the higher downforce tracks. And a big shame for them. And I mean, both Grosjean and Magnussen, they tried a long first on the super softs that was okay, it wasn't too bad, but then the moment they put the ultra softs on, they just chewed them up immediately, and so much so that Grosjean had to make a third pit stop late on. So it was, it's very weird. Like this fight against Renault has been, I think, one of the big talking points of the season. It's been really exciting, this midfield battle, and I think we were hoping that we go to Abu Dhabi with like a couple of points between them, and the status of being best of the rest, and obviously all the constructors' prize money that comes with it. That would all be up for grabs. But now it's a 30-point gap with 2 races to go, and that's a lot for Haas to make up, given that I think it's 4 of the last 6 races they've scored no points at all. So I know they keep saying that they're sort of waiting for this magic bullet and there's one good result like Austria where they got 4th and 5th, but the more the season goes on, the more unlikely that's looking, and the stronger Renault are looking in their position. So a real weekend to forget for Haas. And it is worth emphasising the flip side of that is that Renault have had 2 really good weekends. They've performed extremely strongly. They said they made some operational changes in the United States that seems to have done extremely well for them. They probably would have finished let's say essentially Class B 1-2 behind the front runners had Sainz not retired. So it seems to be really going in opposite directions for them late in the season. And it's strange, because we saw, I think at the start of the year, that Renault, they looked decent, but it wasn't anything outstanding really. Whereas Haas, from day one in Australia, wow, they really got the pace. And I think Haas, they're going to look back on the double DNF in Australia, other events through the season, and say, oh well, that's where we lost some points. But the more the years wearing on, the more you can't really attribute it to 1 or 2 little mistakes that will cost them 4th in the constructors. It is, I think we saw in Mexico, a fundamental lack of pace, a lack of understanding maybe of how the car works at the maximum downforce tracks, and I think that they really need to, for next season, hopefully get on top of that. But the only drawback is you've got to wonder how much they've put into this development battle against Renault, and whether they've sort of gone too far down the rabbit hole this year, so that next year they're going to be thinking, well, we've got a new sponsor, but the car, not so sure. Something we won't mention any further on this program is the sponsor. That was the Mexican Grand Prix. There were a lot of unknowns. It was an interesting race, but at the end of the day, the only story that mattered was Lewis Hamilton winning his 5th World Championship, and it's been a pleasure to talk about it with you, Luke. Thank you, Michael.
That was Luke Smith from Crash.net. The Strategy Report is a Beer Mogul podcast powered by Apex Race Manager, the mobile race management simulator. You can get every episode by subscribing on Google Podcasts and Apple Podcasts. We're also now on Spotify or your favourite podcasting app. And you can leave a review to help other F1 fans find the show. You can also read the written report at f1strategyreport.com and stay up to date by finding us on Facebook and on Twitter. My name's Michael Lamonato. You can find me at Michael Lamonato on Twitter, and I'll catch you in 2 weeks' time for a wrap-up of the Brazilian Grand Prix.